Hey, I'm Steve Lee, and back in 2017, I did a GDC talk about the idea of holistic level design after I finished working on Dishonored 2 at Arcane Studios. Cut to today, 5 years later, and I thought I would make an updated, condensed video version for you to watch here. It's half an hour long and includes a lot of examples from my work on Dishonored 2, but I hope that it feels relevant beyond immersive sims and beyond level design, because as you'll see, I think a lot of this is pretty fundamental to game design in general. So what do I mean by holistic level design? The holistic thing is just about not focusing on one part of something or on the parts in isolation, but thinking about how everything fits together. This has always struck me as really fundamental to level design because when you make levels, you're crafting an experience out of the culmination of the entire team's work. For example, just in this little clip of the Dishonored 2 mission that I worked on, you can see layout design and level scripting, but also UI elements, mechanics and systems design, environment art, animation and mocap, story ideas and dialogue, basically everything. Even if most of these features and content are made by other people in the team, as level designers, it's our job to understand how we can use all these things together to make a cohesive and engaging experience. With that in mind, something that really resonated with me and influenced this talk was a section of this book, 101 Things I Learned at Architecture School. It talked about the idea that beauty is due more to harmonious relationships among the elements of a composition than to the elements themselves. And as it says at the end, it's the dialogue of the pieces, not the pieces themselves, that creates aesthetic success. Now, you might be thinking, well, that sounds very clever and fancy, but what does it actually mean when we apply it to games and level design? To me, these are the three elements that we usually talk about when discussing games: gameplay, presentation, and story. We talk about whether the gameplay is fun, or the graphics are nice, or the story is good. But what I'm talking about isn't really about any of those things in isolation. Instead, it's about a bunch of new concepts that emerge from the relationships between these things. To explain what I mean here, between gameplay and presentation emerge these ideas of affordances and intentionality. And between presentation and story emerges this idea of world building. And finally, between gameplay and story emerges this idea of interactive narrative. So this is what the talk is about, and this has been a very long intro, so let's get stuck in. So first up is affordances and intentionality, two concepts which emerge from this relationship between the gameplay and the way we present things. Affordances is a term that is generally considered to come from the world of industrial design. A great book to read about it is this one, The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. And the classic example of affordances in action is the design of door handles. So here's a quick explanation of what they're about. Here you can see two doors, where the one on the left should be pushed and the one on the right should be pulled. And the problem here is that the handles for both of these doors look the same, and as if they should both be pulled. We've all at some point in our lives approached the door like the one on the left and intuitively pulled it and looked like an idiot. Here we can say the presentation or the signifiers of these affordances are badly designed and misleading. By contrast, here's a much better set of door handles where the shape of the push panel on the left clearly affords being pushed, in a way that contrasts with the one that should be pulled. And in this case, the affordances are so clear and strong that you could actually remove the text from these door handles and use them in any country, and people would just intuitively use them correctly. So it's an industrial designer's job to present affordances clearly and communicate how things work intuitively. In other words, make sure that form conveys function. Doing this is a crucial part of designing anything that is used by people. And of course this includes games and levels. And with something like a Dishonored mission, there are loads of different layers of things to think about. So here are a few examples from the mission that I worked on, which was the Dust District. The key concept for this mission was that there are two factions and two leaders. The player needs to unlock something known as the Jindosh lock to access the building that the next level takes place in. They've been told that if they help either of the factions in the area, then the leader of that faction will give them the information they need to unlock it. So even more explicitly than a typical Dishonored mission, this one was about making a choice. And one of the first things we talked about was reflecting this in the overall layout, and presenting the two factions at a very clear junction. Hopefully this not only makes it very clear that there's a big choice to make, but we also hope that it allows the players to look at the layout from this perspective and visualize and intuitively understand how different this mission can be based on that choice. One of our main opportunities to explain the level to players was the briefing with Megan near the start. We had a lot of meetings about exactly what Megan would tell you in this discussion and exactly how we phrased the objective updates that are triggered after the discussion. because ultimately it's quite a complex mission with a lot of stuff that we could explain to players. But A, we don't really have time unless we make the briefing really long, and B, we don't want to explain so much about the level that we spoil the genuine experience of exploration and discovery. So we were really deliberate about what we make clear to the player, what we keep a total secret, and everything in between. The critical information was this choice between the factions that makes this mission unique, and the fact that this choice will fictionally affect Karnaca and the endings of the game. Something we wanted to tell the player but be very vague about was that there are ways to progress to the next level without helping either faction, and consequently the objective update that you get after this chat looks like this. We tell players that they can either deliver one leader to the other, as Megan suggests, or they can find another way. This provided the right balance between all players understanding what this mission is fundamentally about, while also telling more discerning players that there's a lot more to find in this mission if they take the time to explore and experiment. And finally, there was a huge thing that we didn't want to tell players about at all, and this is that the Jindosh lock, which is the contraption the players have to unlock to progress to the next level, is actually a very hard logic puzzle that they can solve on their own, and if they do this, they can avoid interacting with either of the two factions and basically skip the entire mission. This is because it was something that we only wanted a few of our players to actually do, but we wanted lots of players to discover on their own that it was possible, and then for it to be super satisfying for anyone who actually does it. So on a high level, the overall layout for the mission and the way we discussed the objectives in the briefing played a big part in teaching the player what they can do in this level and why it's interesting. Teaching players with clarity and consistency is a really fundamental skill as a level or game designer, because whatever kind of game you're making, the player always needs a certain level of understanding in order to engage with the interesting challenges or immerse themselves in the intended experience that you're trying to create. And the reason I'm talking about informing players and presenting your affordances in the right way is because this is how you enable the other concept that I mentioned, which is player intentionality. This is a concept that Arcane and all of the old school developers of immersive sims considered to be a fundamental and essential part of game and level design. It goes all the way back to Doug Church talking about it in his seminal game design essay, Formal Abstract Design Tools, back in 1999, a couple of years after Janet Murray discussed it in the context of interactive narrative in her book, Hamlet on the Holodeck. There's probably loads of fancier definitions that you can Google, but my version is that acting with intentionality is about making conscious choices with specific goals and expectations in mind. And this might sound super basic, like something we can take for granted that players are naturally doing all the time when they play a game, but it's often not the case. Here are some examples of weak player intentionality that we've probably all experienced at some point when playing games. The first one is being lost, or trying to find something to do, or trying to figure out what's going on. If we ever get to a point where we're just kind of wandering around aimlessly, then obviously we're not really acting with a very strong sense of intentionality. Another example is doing something without knowing why you're doing it, and only because maybe the game's UI has told you to do it, or because it seems like the only thing you can do, or maybe you're just doing something because you think it's what the designer wants you to do to progress through the level. Or maybe it's that thing where you find a lever in a game and you pull the lever just because you know that you're playing a video game and you're always supposed to pull levers in video games. In these cases, while it could kind of be argued that the player is acting with some sense of intentionality, they're clearly not engaged in the narrative or the fantasy of the game, which is what we want. And finally, another example is when we're reacting to something in a kind of twitchy, impulsive way, in real time to a sudden surprise, like when a monster jumps out at you from behind a door you've just opened, for example. This ends up being more of an instinctive response and less of an intentional choice, so it doesn't really count as intentionality. This concept of player intentionality is at the heart of all immersive sim gameplay and how level design and systems design is approached. To us, intentional play is kind of the whole point. This is why in all of Arcane's games, whether it's Dishonored or Prey, Arx Fatalis or Deathloop, the player is given a very diverse and orthogonal set of powers and abilities, which individually present very simple and clear opportunities to the player, but that can also be used in combination with each other to solve problems in a near infinite number of ways. The clear and consistent low-level affordances that these powers provide allow the player to come up with their own plan for how they're going to deal with a situation, and constantly act with intentionality, rather than simply doing things because the game seems to tell them to. This concept of intentionality is so important at Arcane that as a level designer, if you suggest a gameplay challenge or some kind of optional puzzle or anything like that at some point seems to inherently lack player intentionality, then that will be pointed out as a problem. Forcing players to do things without understanding why they're doing them is generally considered bad design. To break the concept down a little, here are 4 things that I think players need in order to act with intentionality. First of all is the presentation of choice and agency. The second is motivation and having goals in mind. The third is information, the information to understand the situation they're in and have a sense of the possibility space and what they can do. And finally, players need time to process that information so that they aren't rushed into acting without thinking first. And with those 4 things in mind, here are some key ways to facilitate intentional play. The first thing is that it really helps if you present the player with higher level and longer term goals, instead of just drip feeding them low level tasks like look over here, walk in that room, press this button, now do this. It's way cooler to give them a higher level objective which they can find their own solution to. And of course, this is fundamental to how Dishonored always works. The textbook Dishonored mission is that you're on one side of the map, and somewhere on the other side of the map is someone you have to deal with. The game doesn't tell you how to do it, and it's up to you to explore and make your own unique journey towards that goal and resolve things how you choose. The second thing is to have consistent, systemic gameplay mechanics that combine in interesting ways. The low-level consistency of how things work is crucial here, because it enables players to plan how actions and mechanics can be combined to achieve the higher level goals they've been given. And finally is this idea of player-driven pacing and player-initiated action. This relates to the idea that players need time to observe and process the information about their situation, then formulate a plan before acting with intentionality. If it helps, we can think of this process as a 4-step gameplay cycle that the player continuously goes through as they play. If we start at the top with observing, the player is taking in information about their situation and considering that information in relation to their goals and motivations to form a plan. Then, they execute that plan. And assuming the game takes place in real time, there's often a 4th step, where they react to any immediate consequences to the execution of the plan. And then they go back to observing and doing this over and over again. Stealth gameplay is particularly good at emphasizing this loop. It's built into stealth games that the player starts in a hidden state where they have time to think and explore and analyze the situation, and then formulate an intention before acting. Sometimes their actions lead them to being revealed and spotted, in which case they have to start thinking and responding in a more dynamic way, in order to return to the stealth state and start observing and exploring again. In the case of Dishonored, the combination of verticality in the level layouts and the game's mechanics making them very mobile empowers players to reach lots of higher vantage points and hiding places, and these give them more time and a better perspective for their observation and planning phases. Having said all this, I really want to stress that you can design intentional play into any kind of game. It's not about what you're designing, but how you design it, to allow and encourage players to engage with the game in an intentional way. Another thing about intentionality is that I think it affects the way players perceive linearity. In level design, I would generally say that if linearity feels bad, then at least part of the reason is often because the intentionality is lacking or a little weak. If you've seen any of my videos, you'll know that I'm a big fan of Half-Life 2, and one of the things that people often praised it for was this idea that it does a really good job of feeling a lot less linear than it really is. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm not going to go into them all, but intentionality is definitely a big one. When you look at that game, it's clear that Valve playtested their levels so much and iterated on the level design and the scripting and the presentation of affordances so much, that in general, they've done a really good job of aligning what the player wants to do with the thing that they have to do. This means that between the well-designed situations and the well-told story, players are actually engaged in what they're doing, and even though the game is pretty linear, it never really feels like you're doing things without knowing why, or just because the game's UI told you to. In fact, the game's UI doesn't even have objectives or task updates, and it never explicitly tells you what to do. It communicates the player's goals naturally and diegetically through the story's characters, the situations you'll get into, and the consistent affordances of the gameplay objects in the world. To this day, I still think it's a great example of this stuff, with a lot to learn from if you go back and play it. And speaking of great Valve games, let's talk about Portal, which is even more linear than Half-Life 2, despite very few people complaining about it being linear. Again, I think the intentionality thing is a big part of this, because even though there's usually only one solution to progress, being a puzzle game and all, the player is always given the information, the time, and the freedom to experiment with intentionality. So regardless of the linearity, Portal feels like a genuinely player-driven experience, where the player always has a sense of what they're trying to do. Finally, a fun thing that sprung to mind when I was writing this talk were the parallels between what I'm talking about with intentionality and some of the ideas in the movie Inception. Because as a level designer, particularly if your game is quite linear, you're trying to design and present situations in such a way that without holding their hand and leading them through it, players will naturally have the kind of experience that you intend. But you also need to craft it in such a way that they discover things naturally, so that when they reach the conclusions that you want them to, they'll feel like it was their own idea and their own personal experience. Because just like in the film, if they make these choices and reach these conclusions on their own, then the ideas and the feelings will resonate with them much more deeply. So if you can get the immersion and the intentionality right, I think linearity often stops being a problem. Whereas if it's not quite right, players can feel it and they pick up on it. They become less engaged and their immersion is broken when it starts to just feel like the designer is making you jump through a series of hoops and it doesn't feel like an authentic experience. Anyway, fanboying over Christopher Nolan films aside, the point here is that whatever kind of game you're making, and however linear or non-linear it is, this concept of intentionality is a fundamental thing for us to understand as level and game designers. The second big topic of this talk emerges from the relationship between the way we present things and the story, and it's this idea of world building. I'm really into games like Half-Life, Bioshock and Dishonored, and these are all games that are praised for a very rich sense of place and their world building. A lot of this is art direction stuff and high-level story stuff, but as a level designer, you can often also contribute a lot to this too. What I'm going to talk about here relates to a set of 3 goals for world building, which is to create a world that feels unique, cohesive and meaningful. And with those goals in mind, here are a few tips. Tip number 1 is that world building needs to be specific. I mean this both in terms of being detailed in the ideas that you're presenting and not just painting with a really broad brush with genre and setting things in the future and stuff like that. And also that your ideas should be really specific to the world of your game, because it's a specificity that will help your game stand out and resonate with people. But I'm not saying that everything you do needs to be super unique and original. In an interview I read after we shipped Dishonored 2, our creative director Harvey Smith used Kieran Jindosh as an example of a character who was a pretty well used archetype in this kind of game, basically a crazy evil genius scientist guy. But by layering details and specificity onto this archetype, the character turned from someone who could easily have felt like a bit of a cliché into someone who feels unique and helps develop the unique world of Dishonored 2. To run through a few examples of these details, our crazy evil scientist guy has a pretty distinctive look. He kinda looks like a love child of Nikola Tesla and Prince, which reflects both his impressive intellect and his eccentric personality. There's a little story and visual detail about how he lost his finger and thumb in an industrial accident, and in its place he's invented a bionic thumb that he can smoke like a pipe. And when he's tasked with securing an important building in the Dust District, he does this using a super obscure puzzle that he's invented, the Jindosh lock, literally locking people out based on a kind of intelligence test. Not to mention, of course, that he lives in the Clockwork Mansion, a giant transforming building that doubles up as a museum for his own creations and genius. This building, and the entire level that takes place in it, reflects and develops his character, and his contribution to the world of Karnaca and Dishonored. Now, some of the details I talked about might seem trivial on their own, like his bionic thumb for example, but altogether they add enough specificity to the character to help him stop feeling like just a cliché or a trope or whatever, and become unique enough to contribute to the world building. With this kind of thing in mind, I tried to populate the Dust District with scenes that are not only specific to the Dishonored universe, but also specific to this particular district, which has its own unique story. To explain them quickly, on the left is a scene set inside the Black Market, which is a shop where you can go in and talk to someone and spend your money on useful items and things. I didn't want it to just be this purely functional gameplay thing, so I added this scene where Howlers, who are like the Mafia-style faction of the game, are harassing the shopkeeper for protection money. They're claiming that they're protecting them from the Overseers, who everybody knows would take issue with the fact that they're selling magical stuff like bone charms and runes in their shop. So firstly, instead of this shop just being another gameplay thing, I created this narrative scene to fictionally integrate it into the specific world of this district. Secondly, I used this idea of a gang pressuring a shopkeeper into giving them money, which is quite a textbook mafia-style thing to do in this kind of world, but I made sure to put a twist on it that is specific to the fiction of this game and this level. Now onto the scene in the middle, where overseers are executing civilians for breaking their religious principles, and doing things that are generally considered impure and forbidden. Even more than the first scene, this clearly invites the player to intervene and interact with the scene, instead of just watching it, which I'll talk more about later. The scene is also used as a useful opportunity for the overseers to actually read out their ideology to the people in the lineup and to the player, which helps to flesh them out as affection and give the player an opinion about them, which is important to the choice that they're making in this mission. And on the right, there's a scene inside the Overseer outpost where an Overseer is mercy killing a friend, another Overseer, after he was mortally wounded in a fight with Howlers. Through the way that it's done and the way they talk about it, the idea was to show a particular kind of discipline and conviction that characterizes the way the Overseers think. It also shows the Overseers in a more sympathetic light, which is unusual and I thought would be an interesting thing to do when the player is presumably on the way to assassinate their leader. So as I've said, all of these scenes are supposed to convey information that is specific to these factions in this district and in this game. And in general, I think it's important for world building to be as specific as we can make it. Point number 2 about world building is simply to try and think of ways to do it with everything you do. Try to be conscious of when you're just designing things on a kind of creative autopilot, and you're just following the formula of how you think this kind of thing is usually done. Try to find ways to make every aspect of your level complement what the world and the story of your game is about. One little example of this in the Dust District is that I knew I wanted somewhere in the Overseer HQ where the player could find some really juicy loot. And in Dishonored, this kind of valuable loot is often magical stuff. The fictional backdrop of the level is that Overseers are moving into this area and encroaching on Howler territory, and they're totally against magical stuff. So I could make sense of the Overseers having magical stuff in their HQ by showing that they confiscated it from the locals in the area. On top of this, I put this stuff in a small room behind a locked door, and I gave the key to an Overseer who is sleeping in a room nearby. So there's a little gameplay idea that connects to a little narrative idea, and the player is naturally flowing between the two. My third tip for world building is that it's generally good if your world building says things about the people in that world. This is because world building is a form of storytelling, and stories are basically always about us as people and human ideas in general. In film, a great example of this is Children of Men, which I really recommend if you haven't seen it. In this film, the world building is always very clearly about us as people, and what would become of us in a world where hope is fading away. In practically every shot of this film, the background and the mise-en-scène is speaking to us about how this loss of hope would change our society. For example, how it would change the role of police, and people's political values like attitudes to immigrants, and even our attitude to suicide. In games, the classic example is BioShock, where every part of its world is contributing to a vision of a crumbling dysfunctional society, founded upon relentlessly pursuing progress, inspired by the objectivist theories of Ayn Rand. So what kind of ideas define the world of Dishonored? For me, it's about class and power relationships and privilege and corruption, and the idea that everybody, depending on their place in society, is either screwing someone over or being screwed over by somebody else. And of course, it's the lower class citizens who get screwed the most. The Dust District is generally a lower class area, a mining district, and as a central architectural feature in the level, we created a very bespoke wooden raised street, a kind of shelter that people have built in response to the dust storms and the environmental problems that have been caused by the Duke. It represents how the people here are figuratively, but also literally, being pushed underground by the problems caused by the people in power, and also that they're trapped in the middle of an ideological fight between the Howler and the Overseer factions. This is reflected in the way that the street is placed in the middle of the map between the two HQs. So beyond just being visually interesting, we designed it to be a symbol of the story and the power relationship of this district and its people, supporting the broader themes and the tone of the Dishonored universe in general. This idea that people in society are victims of the people above them. So to summarize, these were my 3 points about world building. Point number 1 was that world building should be specific. Point number 2 was that we should always try to be world building, and that almost every aspect of our level design can be seen as an opportunity. And point number 3 was about the importance of saying things about the people in your world, and relating to human ideas in general, to tell a more resonant and meaningful story. So that's the world building section of this talk. The third and final part is about interactive narrative, this really big and complex idea that naturally emerges from the relationship between gameplay and story. Interactive storytelling is obviously a huge topic that I couldn't hope to cover in a small part of this talk, but most of what I wanted to focus on related to this idea of show don't tell, and what this phrase might mean to the medium of games rather than film and literature. To explain what I mean by this, in film, show don't tell is generally about this idea of telling the story using the unique strength of the medium, which is moving pictures and sound and editing between them in a way that evokes drama and ideas. In literature, show don't tell is more about the idea of writing in a way that evokes ideas and drama in the reader's mind and imagination, rather than simply telling them what happened and how to feel about it. This idea is famously summed up by the Russian novelist Anton Chekhov, when he said, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." So if we take the key parts of what this phrase means to film and literature, we have this: using the unique strength of the medium, and evoking drama and ideas in the audience's mind. Let's start with using the unique strength of the medium, which in the case of games is obviously their interactivity. Bearing in mind what I said earlier about the importance of intentionality to gameplay and engaging interaction, if we're talking about interactive narrative, then we can think about the idea of narrative intentionality. By this, I mean intentionality that is driven by narrative goals and motivations rather than abstract gameplay ones. In the case of Dishonored, the player's ability to act with narrative intentionality is kind of constant throughout the entire game, because while sneaking through any level in the game, the player has choices about how stealthy they are, or violent, or non-violent, and the game tells them that playing violently will have consequences on the world of the game and influence certain outcomes of the story. This has the effect of transforming what would be a bunch of simple gameplay choices of killing enemies and a simple goal just to get to the end of the level into loads of little opportunities to act with and express narrative intentionality. It gives players a reason to care about who they are in the story and the role that they choose to play. Going back to the Dust District, one of the main things that appealed to me about this particular mission when I was given it to work on was that it presents a choice to the player that isn't just about dealing with a target in a lethal or non-lethal way, but a choice about two factions and two ideologies. In other words, more layers of narrative intentionality for the player to consider when they choose how to play this mission. If we go back to these 3 scenes in the level that I mentioned in the world building section, another layer to these scenes is that I deliberately designed them to encourage the player to interact with them with narrative intentionality. They're not just scenes that you watch, and I'm not just showing and telling you story stuff here in a non-interactive way. These scenes are deliberately designed to be interrupted and interacted with, and kind of provoke the player into making interesting narrative choices. They feature extra lines and scripting and stuff beyond the main scene to react to certain choices that the player can make, and they're designed to be dramatic situations that present the player with narrative questions. Questions like whether they care about what is happening around them, and if so, what are they going to do about it? And if they choose to engage and pursue whatever goals they might have, are they willing to resort to and tolerate violence, or do they take the time to resolve things in a non-violent way? As far as I'm concerned, whenever I can make a player make gameplay choices with narrative goals in mind and not just gameplay ones, the experience becomes inherently more immersive and interesting. So that was about using the unique strength of the medium, interactivity, and how that leads to the idea of narrative intentionality. If we take a look at literature's take on this phrase, we have this idea of evoking drama and ideas in the audience's mind and imagination. I'm going to talk about 2 examples of this, and my first one is the classic pick up the can scene from Half-Life 2. This scene is basically a tutorial for the player picking up and interacting with physics objects, but what's cool is that the level designer used this as an opportunity to do something much more interesting. As the player approaches, the Combine guard knocks the can off the bin and patronisingly tells them to pick it up and drop it in. When the player picks the can up, the game's UI tells them that physics objects can be thrown. And of course, the tempting thing to do now is to throw the can at the guard's head as a cheeky little act of protest. Not only does this introduce some fun and choice into the tutorial, but this little choice is also helping establish the story of the game. Because this binary choice between obeying and rebelling basically sums up the human condition in the world of City 17. Every human citizen here, in a world being taken over by the Combine, is struggling with this choice of whether they should obey and conform, or resist and rebel. And by being oppressed by the Combine directly and making this choice ourselves, we as players relate to them as people and their plight. And that means that when you come to this scene a bit later in the game, you don't just shoot the baddies because they're baddies in a video game, but you naturally side with the civilians because you relate to them. And you're naturally opposed to the Combine based on a personal interactive experience that came before. So even though Half-Life 2's story and gameplay is generally quite scripted and linear, to me it still qualifies as very solid immersive interactive storytelling, because it's very smart about involving the player in the ideas and themes of the story. It's important to remember how much of the experience of a game and its story happens in the player's mind, and not necessarily on screen, and how much more effective it is when this is the case. This idea was well summarised by the film director Frank Capra, who once said this: "I made mistakes in drama. I thought that drama was when the actors cried, but drama is when the audience cries." And of course, we can take that idea and apply it to games, because we want the player's interactive experience of a game to be these dramatic highs and lows, instead of them just being something they watch on screen. This brings us back to the show don't tell thing, and the question of what show don't tell means to games. Whatever our game and narrative is, how do we show interactively? My other example of doing this is from Heavy Rain, a game which is very cinematic in its presentation, to the point where some people criticize it for being too much like a movie and not interactive enough. But I think this particular scene is a really interesting example of what I'm talking about. It's from the beginning of the game, establishing you as the main character, a father in a story about losing your child and doing anything to save them. You've just woken up in the morning and you're out in the garden, play fighting with your kids in a very melodramatic Star Wars video game kind of way. And as with a lot of Heavy Rain, it's a sequence of QuickTime events, where a button prompt appears on the screen, and based on whether or not you succeed or fail at pressing it in time, the scene plays out differently. The interesting thing here is that if we follow our traditional gamer instincts and just try to selfishly win everything, then we end up being a super douchey dad in the process. I've watched a lot of playthroughs of this sequence on YouTube, and it's really good at making players realize this as they play, and change the way they play based on a narrative desire to play the role of a good dad. And this is kind of cool, because there's a lot of subtext going on in this scene. These little choices are a kind of interactive metaphor for what it means to become a parent, because when you have a kid, succeeding in your own selfish terms is no longer the priority. Your life becomes more about helping them and not you, and that's what this whole scene is about, and conveys interactively, by allowing a player to choose whether they win the fight. It's a great example of how we can take a game mechanic, even something that seems as basic and binary and typically trivial as pressing a button in time, and use it to interactively evoke some fairly big ideas about the character and the story, and about life in general. And all of this really happens in the player's imagination, without the game explicitly telling them anything, which is awesome. So to summarise this section on interactive narrative, these are my 3 points. The first one was about the idea of show don't tell, and what that really means in the context of games, and making sure that we're thinking about the most interactively interesting ways of executing our ideas. Number 2 was about empowering a player to act with narrative intentionality, and what that means. And finally, 3 was about finding ways to evoke drama and ideas in the player's mind and imagination, and not just showing everything happening on the screen. To wrap up, I thought about this section of a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is a super smart book that I recommend to everyone. It's written to educate people and change people's perspective on comics, but I think it has the effect of changing the way we look at pretty much every medium. In this section of the book, he talks about how comics used to suffer from people assuming that because comics are a medium made of pictures and words, that you can just take a great artist and a great writer and just throw them together and you'll have a great comic. Whereas in reality, of course, if all you do is just put nice writerly words on nice painterly pictures, then you'll probably only end up with something that's a pretty shallow form of a comic that doesn't really utilize the true magic of the medium. The point is that the power of great comics doesn't come from simply combining these two things. It comes from a range of new and unique creative principles and techniques that emerge from the unique relationship between these things that comics create, and that ultimately set the medium apart from all others. And of course, the whole point of this talk is to emphasize how a similar thing applies to games and level design. I think we've all played games before where these 3 elements I talked about, the gameplay, the story, and the fancy graphics and stuff, they're all good individually, but they don't seem to gel very well, or they aren't working together to create something new and interesting. And to me, when games and level design are at their peak, it's all about how these things work together. For those familiar with the genre known as immersive sims, I think this framework of ideas really speaks to what the immersive part of immersive sim actually means, and what the player is actually thinking about all the time as they play. And I think that as level designers working with other disciplines, and as teams in general, the more that we can discuss and establish these kinds of ideas as shared goals between departments, the better and more interesting our games will be. And that's the end of the talk and this massive video. I hope you found it interesting and got something out of it, because to be honest, it took me ages. Let me know what you think in the comments and share it around if you know someone who will be into it. Cheers and see you next time.